She's wearing my tie. How'd you like my tie? How do you like it?
I got your tie.
I like that tie, and I love his films even more. The inimitable Alfred Hitchcock advertising one of his suspense films. And the nationwide revival of 5 films by Alfred Hitchcock is the subject of the special edition of At the Movies, the movie review program. And across the aisle from me, Roger Ebert, film critic of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And across the aisle from me is Gene Siskel, film critic of the Chicago Tribune. Now, you could almost subtitle this program, The Case of the Missing Hitchcocks, because the 5 films we're going to look at have been out of circulation for years, for more than a decade. Of course, most Alfred Hitchcock movies turn up all the time in revival theaters, at film societies, and on TV, and audiences never seem to get tired of watching Hitchcock, and I know that I never have. But 5 of his films never turned up. They were out of release for a long time. What happened to them? Well, there was a reason for that. Hitchcock himself personally owned the rights, and he wanted to hold on to them and keep these movies out of release in order to increase their value to his estate for his daughter, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. Universal Studios bought the distribution rights for the films from Hitchcock's estate earlier this year, and starting this weekend in New York, next week in Chicago, and then on a city-by-city basis around the country, they're going back in release for the first time in years. The package includes Vertigo, the film many critics believe is the best one that Hitchcock ever made, Rope, which was filmed to look like one single very long uninterrupted shot, The Man Who Knew Too Much with its famous murder timed to a clash of cymbals, The Trouble with Harry with its dead body that just wouldn't disappear, and now Gene starts with maybe the best-loved movie that Hitchcock ever made, Rear Window.
Rear Window is a marvelously entertaining film, and yet at the same time it is a serious piece of art, revealing the voyeur in all of us. In Rear Window, James Stewart plays a news magazine photographer recently hurt in an accident and now confined to a wheelchair. He's a photographer, a professional voyeur, a professional looker by trade, and so instinctively he spends his days looking out the window of his Greenwich Village apartment building, staring into the open apartments of his neighbors, who thankfully don't close their drapes very often. In one apartment, he thinks he sees evidence indicating a murder has been committed. He thinks a burly husband, played by Raymond Burr, has sawed his wife apart and taken her body out of the apartment piece by piece in suitcases. And in a classic scene, Stewart's girlfriend, played luminously by Grace Kelly, she looks for evidence by entering the apartment of the suspected killer while he's out of the building.
Lisa! Lisa!
Precinct 6, Sergeant Allgood.
Hello. Look, a man is assaulting a woman at 125 West 9th Street, second floor, at the rear. No, make it fast. L.B. Jeffries. Chelsea 25598.
The effect of that scene is absolutely hypnotic. Of course, we're looking through the camera's eyes, but we're also looking through James Stewart's eyes, and the doubling effect is quite powerful. And if that scene seems familiar in any way, it's because it has been copied so many times in so many thrillers that we've seen. It's a classic scene in direction in the way that Hitchcock, the director, takes control of our eyes and builds the tension, while at the same time revealing that we, along with Jimmy Stewart, and I love the way he's grunting and just grunting and getting all excited there, that we all like to visually eavesdrop on others. That's why we go to the movies, Hitchcock seems to be saying, and some of us go to the movies a lot more than others. This is a movie critic's film.
You're right about that. Now, one thing we're going to be doing on this program is looking at 5 Hitchcock movies, and I think that that one has 2 themes you're going to see time and again. And you put your finger on the first one, which is the voyeur.
Right.
In a way, the Jimmy Stewart character is Hitchcock. He's stuck in that chair. He's not part of the action. He's watching the action. He's got that big lens, and he watches every one of those windows is like a different movie screen with a different story.
Right.
The second thing, the cool, icy blonde.
Right.
Time and again in his movies, Hitchcock has a blonde. Doris Day, Grace Kelly, Eva Marie Saint, Tippi Hedren. Here it's Grace Kelly, and it's very interesting that the blonde wants Stewart to be in love with her. Why won't you marry me? But he's too busy looking. He kind of puts her to the side and doesn't take her seriously. He'd rather eavesdrop on the lives of others than have a life of his own, in a way.
And the other thing that I enjoyed about the film is we look into the other apartments, other than the murder scene, which takes, you know, the centerpiece of this film. The other lives, we see people in all sorts of situations because they're not in love. We see people that one person likes their pet cat. Another person sets the table for a date that she thinks she's going to have, but nobody comes. It's quite a powerful statement as he looks through that apartment building of what Hitchcock saw in the human condition of people quite unhappy because they're not in love.
He doesn't see anything in any of those apartments that's quite normal.
No. Our next film is The Man Who Knew Too Much, the 1956 version with Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day. Hitchcock filmed this script once before in his native England, where it was a big success, and this longer version in color and with big stars was a success too. The story is a tourist nightmare with Jimmy Stewart playing a doctor from Indiana on vacation in Morocco with his wife, played by Doris Day, and with his young son. And Stewart soon finds himself in terrible trouble in the Marrakesh marketplace, where a man he has just met is murdered. A classic Hitchcock scene here. Oh, the transfers of jeopardy there, the makeup from one face to another's hands. Beautifully done, a great scene. And actually, The Man Who Knew Too Much is more a collection of great scenes, I think, than a great movie. There are lots of holes in this story, and indeed, maybe this point should be made right away, that these 5 films that we're discussing are not the 5 greatest Hitchcock films ever made, just 5 that haven't been seen for a while.
I agree with you. The Man Who Knew Too Much is more great scenes than a great movie because there are a lot of questions that we have to ask. Usually, Hitchcock tried to make watertight plots. This one has a lot of holes in it, but it also has that fabulous scene at the end where the murder in Royal Albert Hall is all timed to the clash of cymbals in the symphony orchestra, and we know when it's going to come at that
That's
point
a great
in the music.
One. I think those are the 2 best scenes in the movie.
Until I saw The Man Who Knew Too Much, I'd totally forgotten that Doris Day sings in it. And since it's the only musical number that Alfred Hitchcock ever directed, and it won an Academy Award, we thought we'd show you a little bit of it.
Que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be.
That wasn't real interesting, was it? You know, maybe if she were being stabbed while she was singing, he would have directed that scene better.
His heart was not in it.
Not at all. To sum up, and I hope everyone sees these pictures again, because what it did for me was remind me how sloppily made most movies are today by comparison, how impersonal, how passionless most movies are. This reminds us of the standard of what movies can be.
And what I get from a Hitchcock film, and I get it from only the greatest directors, is a real sense of somebody standing right there behind the camera, whose obsessions and whose passions and whose care is really focused in the image that he's shooting. It's really a strong kind of presence.
Right. And we ought to praise Jimmy Stewart, his contribution. He's in 4 of the 5 films that we're discussing on this show. And Stewart, in close-up, is used beautifully and uses the camera beautifully, just knowing what to do with his eyes at every single moment. He could wear any costume: soldier, cowboy, baseball player, lawyer, and it always fit perfectly. He could play any emotion: psychological torment, righteous outrage, giddy delight, and we knew exactly what he was experiencing. That's the definition of an actor and of a star, and it was the definition of James Stewart, who died this week at age 89.
All you people don't know about lost causes. Mr. Payne does. He said once they were the only causes worth fighting for.
James Stewart was best known for playing unassuming men with strong ideals who were tested in tough circumstances. For example, the young senator in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Because of just one plain simple rule. Love thy neighbor.
He won his Oscar playing a newspaper reporter smitten by spoiled heiress Katharine Hepburn in the Philadelphia Story.
It can't be anything like love, can it?
No, it mustn't be. It can't.
Would it be inconvenient?
Terribly.
He was Alfred Hitchcock's favorite actor, appearing in such acclaimed pictures as Vertigo, and Rear Window.
A murderer would never parade his crime in front of an open window.
Why not?
Why, for all you know, there's probably something a lot more sinister going on behind those windows.
Where? Oh. No comment.
Stewart starred in a string of biographies in the 1950s, playing one decent man after another. He represented the best of American manhood in films like The Glenn Miller Story.
Now listen to this. Now what? Pennsylvania 6, 5,000.
Of course, his most enduring role was in a 51-year-old movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And of course, that's not the title of just a movie. It's the title of the James Stewart story.
That's a Christmas present from a very dear friend of mine.
There are no bad stories out there about James Stewart, no tell-all books waiting in the wings. War hero, husband, he did it all whenever tested in real life. Maybe that's why kids like me who grew up in the 1950s wanted to be like Jimmy Stewart, or wanted to be close to him. Didn't you? Didn't you?
I want to be more like Robert Mitchum. But nevertheless, he was a great man. He was a great actor. And what's interesting is the way that he reinvented his career after World War II, because in the 30s and early 40s, he played basically a nice guy in Philadelphia Story and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And then, of course, right after the war, It's a Wonderful Life. But then, starting with those westerns in the early 50s, like Winchester 73, and then in the Hitchcock pictures, you saw a dark side to Jimmy Stewart. You saw the anger, you saw the passion, you saw the troubled internal problems of this guy who had been an American icon. And that was the example of growth that made Jimmy Stewart's career so long and so durable, especially in Vertigo, which was his best picture and Hitchcock's best picture. It's interesting that Stewart played so many biographical roles like Glenn Miller and Charles Lindbergh, and here he was really playing the most autobiographical role that Hitchcock ever wrote, because this guy reflects Hitchcock's own obsession with trying to control the women that he was obsessed by.
This was an actor, and he showed it in a variety of circumstances. He could play anything that was thrown at him with a cleanliness, a clean line. You never caught him acting. That's what Capra used to say about him. He was not someone you thought of as an actor.
You're absolutely right, and what's really typical of both of the giants who died this week is the fact that both of them made it look so easy that they didn't always get the credit they deserved for the acting that they did. He and Cary Grant were probably the two basic Hitchcock heroes. But in my favorite Cary Grant movie, which we also know is your favorite Cary Grant movie, is also one of my favorite movies of all time. It's on my list of the 10 greatest films ever made, and it's called Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious, with Grant playing an American agent who heartlessly and cold-bloodedly sends Ingrid Bergman, the woman he loves, into marriage with a Nazi spy played by Claude Rains. The movie contains one of the greatest kissing scenes of all time, the longest kissing scene up until the moment this movie was made, and notice how passionate Bergman is and how Grant plays hard to get.
This is a very strange love affair.
Why?
Maybe the fact that you don't love me.
Hello? Palace Hotel? Calling Days? It's T.R. Devlin. Any messages for me? When I don't love you, I'll let you know.
What's great about Grant's performance in this movie is that the whole plot is really about what he thinks about her. That's really what the movie is about. First, he only wants to use her. Then, he falls in love with her. Then he thinks she's turned into a lush, but actually it's arsenic poisoning from the Nazis. But then he realizes his mistake, goes in and rescues her, and there's a romantic ending. Who but Cary Grant could have summoned up enough irony to go through all of those changes with a straight face? It's a great movie, and a great way to remember the man who some critics have called the greatest movie star of all time.
And I like the line you just said, with a straight face, because this is what acting is about. Alec Guinness in his Academy Award speech said the art of acting is doing nothing in front of the camera. And Grant goes through all of these changes and really doesn't use a whole lot of body language. He knows what we can read through his eyes and manner, and this is my favorite Cary Grant film. It is one of the greatest films of all time. Rent it if you haven't seen it, and rent it if you have.
And Cary Grant himself was often the first person to put down his own wonderful, enormous talent. There's a great Cary Grant story where he was asked by a younger actor, "What do you need to be a great movie star?" And his answer, "A tan."
Well, he had more than that, I think.
A lot of people think our next movie, Vertigo, is the best one that Alfred Hitchcock ever directed. And I know I put it on a very short list, along with Notorious, Strangers on a Train, and Psycho. It's also maybe the most personal film Hitchcock ever made, because it's about a man with an almost fetishistic obsession for a beautiful, cool, blonde woman. And Hitchcock, of course, loved to put cool blondes into his movies and then work them over in the most unpleasant ways. In Vertigo, James Stewart stars as a retired detective with a fear of heights, a man who's hired to shadow another man's wife. The woman is played by Kim Novak, and in this scene, as she tells him about a dream, Stewart realizes that he's fallen in love with her.
It's part his dream, I think. There's a tower and a bell in the garden below. Seems to be in Spain. Village in Spain. Clicks off and it's gone.
Well, a portrait. Do you see a portrait?
No.
If I could just find the key, the beginning, and put it together.
So explain it away. There is a way to explain it, you see. If I'm mad, well, that would explain it, wouldn't it?
Madeline!
I'm scared. I'm not mad, I'm not mad. I don't want to die. There's someone within me, and she says I must die. Oh, Scotty, don't let me go.
I'm here. I've got you.
I'm so afraid.
Stewart's fear of heights is exploited in one of the movie's most famous scenes as he chases Novak up an old mission tower.
Madeline!
What's neat there is the way that Hitchcock got that effect of Stewart looking down the stairs and having that sense of vertigo. He did that by doing two things at the same time, one with his camera, one with his lens. He pulled back the camera physically while zooming in with the lens, so you got kind of a tearing sensation there. It was really dramatic. What makes those scenes work so well is the amazingly powerful strength of the obsession, I think, and not just Jimmy Stewart's obsession with that mysterious woman, but Hitchcock's obsession too, because we said that Rear Window was autobiographical because it showed a man who was a voyeur, always looking at other lives through a camera lens. Well, Vertigo is the other half of that autobiography, showing a man who tries to mold and change every woman into his own ideal blonde fantasy woman. The hair always had to be just the same, which is what Hitchcock did with Ingrid Bergman and Grace Kelly and Kim Novak, and we already mentioned Eva Marie Saint and Tippi Hedren. One of the things that made him great, I think, was that ironically, he really was making movies for himself and about himself.
I think what's fascinating is here's a director working in the Hollywood system and working with big stars, and yet he makes a picture that is totally uncompromising, totally personal. There is no concession here to what the audience might like to see. This is a vaguely... No, it's an unpleasant experience, but hypnotic. And I think it's that, you're quite correct, it is the obsession with the appearance, the surface appearance. This man would rather dress a mannequin. He's turned her into a mannequin. He'd rather do that than engage her personality.
He's not involved with a woman as a personality. He's involved only with the fact that she has to look exactly like this woman of his dreams. And when he finds out, Stewart, at the end of the movie, that he's been tricked, what amazed me seeing this movie again for the first time in 10 or 15 years was the power of his anger. It's almost like the director's anger coming through the camera and speaking through Stewart as if he has all this frustration against these women who he's never been able to deal with, either the character or the director in real life, but only by trying to mold and manipulate them in the movies.
Yes, and the music here is absolutely fabulous.
That's another thing.
Bernard Herrmann, just beautiful on that scene we saw on the beach. Director Alfred Hitchcock is one of the true masters of the cinema, but because of his hit TV show, he's usually tagged with the qualifier Master of Suspense. Well, he was much more than that, and in no film is this more obvious than Vertigo from 1958, a study of obsessive fear and longing, with James Stewart playing a detective who has a fear of heights. Here's the famous way we're introduced to his phobia in a chase over the rooftops of San Francisco.
Give me your hand.
Racked by guilt and fear and unable to perform his police duties, Stewart is soon hired by an old friend to shadow the man's possibly suicidal wife, played by Kim Novak. Stewart ends up falling in love with this woman, but he is actually being set up in an elaborate con that Hitchcock lets us in on well before the movie is over, a bold, dramatic move. Unaware of being tricked as part of a murder cover-up, Stewart becomes unglued during the trip the lovers take to an old mission church. Later, with his new love apparently dead, Stewart spots a woman who reminds him of her, and he begins to make her over in the image of his seemingly dead fantasy. Kim Novak, of course, plays both roles.
We could just see a lot of each other.
Why? Does it remind you of her?
And here in the film's most powerful scene is the moment of the makeover, and pay attention to the imagery as well as the heartbreaking musical score by the great Bernard Herrmann. The print of Vertigo, like so many films of the 1950s, was in terrible shape, and it's been restored by the team of Robert Harris and James C. Katz, who, separately or together, have worked similar wonders with Spartacus and Lawrence of Arabia and My Fair Lady. The soundtrack is being heard in stereo for the first time since its initial release. If you haven't seen Vertigo from the master Alfred Hitchcock in a theater, I envy your first time.
It's a wonderful film. And you know, what's so poignant about that last scene that you showed is that she, and I'm not giving anything away because you said it's the same woman, she loves him for himself enough to pretend to be this other woman. He loves this fantasy woman more than the flesh and blood woman in front of him. And as the two of them come together, there's so much poignancy and so much irony and so much passion going on in that room. It's one of the greatest erotic and passionate scenes ever put on film.
Well, let's get even more specific. It can stand for a lot of marital relationships.
Yes,
I mean, let's nail it right down.
Yes,
and I think we really ought to credit the writers of the film as well. Our next film is Rope, Hitchcock's attempt to film a movie so that it appears as if it is one long, unbroken shot. No cuts, no editing. Now, of course, this was impossible to do in 1948. The biggest can of film for the cameras then was 10 minutes, and so what Hitchcock does in Rope is let the action play for about 10 minutes, and then as the film is about to run out in his camera, the camera moves into focus on the back of a suit coat of one of the actors. He then reloaded his camera, new film, and filming began on the same suit coat, and the camera pulls away to start the story again. The story of Rope is a psychological thriller based in part on the famous Leopold and Loeb thrill murder case with two college boys committing the murder of one of their classmates just for the thrill of it. They stash the body in a chest in the living room of their apartment where they are hosting a cocktail party for the dead student's parents and fiancé. And James Stewart plays a professor who suspects their nervousness has something to do with the missing student who was choked to death with a piece of rope.
You're, more than usually allergic to the truth tonight, Philip. That's the second time you haven't told me.
Thanks. When was the first?
When you said you'd never strangled a chicken.
You're confused. Brandon dreamt that up for the sake of a very unfunny joke.
No, he didn't. No, he didn't, Philip. And if you'll think back very carefully, you'll realize that I know he didn't. About a year ago, I was up at the farm, you remember? One morning I saw you display your handiwork. You're quite a good chicken strangler, as I recall.
Well, I just meant that Brandon's story wasn't true. I didn't mean I hadn't killed any chickens.
That's what you said.
Well, I didn't think it was a suitable topic of conversation while we were eating.
You could have said that.
All right, I didn't.
We're not eating now, Philip. What'd you lie to me for?
Because I don't like to talk about...
About what? Strangling?
I can't play with that thing.
I want you to have them very much.
It's extremely generous of you, Brandon. I don't know.
Please, I know you appreciate first editions far more than I, Mr. Kentley.
It's really very nice of you, Brandon.
What's wrong?
You and Philip must come to dinner very soon.
What's wrong
I'll
now,
get David to fix the
Don't you want Mr. Kentley to have the books?
No. I mean, I don't care if he has them. I just...
What?
I just think it's a clumsy way of tying them up, that's all.
Now, the acting in Rope, you've got to admit, is stilted and overdone and wildly frantic there. It sort of reminded me of that anti-marijuana film, Reefer Madness, remember? Play faster, play faster. And the gimmick about the unbroken shot, well, it's gimmicky every time we get a close-up on a suit coat. You know, what's his obsession there? But there is a certain tension here, and we appreciate that Hitchcock was trying to do something special with this film. His films often are so spellbinding, literally binding us to the screen. And here in 1948, in Rope, we see Hitchcock declaring his desire to literally weld our eyes directly to the screen. No edits from him, no blinking from us. And there is a power in that attempt, and that's why even with all the bad acting, I sort of enjoyed Rope.
Now, you talk about the bad acting. It seems almost heretical to say that Jimmy Stewart was doing bad acting. This was the first time, by the way, that Stewart ever worked with Hitchcock, and Hitchcock liked him so much that he used him as his alter ego in Rear Window, Vertigo, Man Who Knew Too Much, and so forth. But what some of the actors said about this film was that the reason the acting seemed so strained is that everything depended upon them making no mistakes for 10 minutes. Everybody had to be right. The actors had to be right. The technicians are hauling sets out of the way. The lights are moving around. The camera's moving around. If one person blows one line, they have to start all over again. It costs thousands of dollars, and so they just absolutely could not relax.
At the same time, when I watched these guys trying to hide their crime, the thrill of crime, which is certainly a theme in Hitchcock, and he's always getting the audience in on it, and we recognize our own sense of thrill with crime, that is communicated in this picture, so I think it's a partial success.
It's an interesting film. I was glad I saw it. Our next movie is a real curiosity, a weird film even by Hitchcock standards. It's called The Trouble with Harry, and it's a whimsical story about a dead body named Harry and about the simple folks in the small Vermont town who try to deal with the terribly embarrassing question of what to do with Harry. John Forsythe and Shirley MacLaine team up with a local eccentric and an old maid to dispose of the body, and they try everything. They bury it 3 or 4 times, they give it a bath, they have it declared dead by the local doctor, and in this scene, they try to stuff it in the bathroom when the sheriff arrives.
But I still got enough evidence to know something funny's going on around here. I ain't going to sleep till I find out what it is.
Hi, Calvin.
Hey, what's he doing in our bathtub?
That's where frogs belong.
Oh.
There, I'll be back to bed.
State troopers will be up in the morning. I'm going to want them to have a talk with you. They'll be around.
Well, you can find me at my studio.
Just make sure.
The dispassionate way they deal with death seems to be Hitchcock's private joke in this movie, and it's a really deadpan approach, all right. Too deadpan, if you ask me. It's an intriguing experiment in sick humor, but I don't think it really works. And the way that they stand around saying, what are we going to do with this body, it gets to be a little bit old after a while.
Well, it gets old. I think this would be a nice half-hour Alfred Hitchcock Presents show, you know, one from the 50s, but stretched out to 100 minutes. the joke gets old real fast.
My video pick this week is a beautifully transferred DVD version of Psycho, the 1961 Alfred Hitchcock classic that's considered one of his 2 or 3 greatest films. It starred Anthony Perkins, of course, as the proprietor of the Bates Motel, and Janet Leigh as the guest who steps into the shower and into one of the most famous scenes ever filmed. This is a disc that includes a lot of extras, including a close look at the shower scene.
But Hitch had very strong ideas about that scene. So at that point, Saul Bass came in and did a storyboard on it.
And there's Hitchcock's famous coming attractions trailer where he takes the audience on a tour of his set.
Well, they cleaned all this up, you know. Big difference. You should have seen the blood. The whole place was, well, it's too horrible to describe. Dreadful.
And the 90-minute documentary about the making of Psycho.
The problem was what to wear so that it looked like I was nude. I mean, that was the biggest problem of all. Rita Riggs, the wardrobe girl, and I pored over these strip teaser magazines that showed all the different costumes, but none of them worked because they all had whirly-jigs on them or something.
The timing for this DVD release couldn't be better because for reasons that remain completely inexplicable to me, director Gus Van Sant is doing not a remake, but a recreation of Psycho based on the original script. If there was ever a film crying out not to be made, this is that film. No need to have this remake. It's available, by the way, on DVD, laser, and VHS in video stores right now.
We've said it before. Remake flawed films.
Yes.
Don't remake.
Or remake trivial films, remake nice little films.
Yeah.
Don't remake masterpieces. If it works, don't fix it.
You got it.
Mr. Hitchcock, Roger Ebert from the Chicago Sun-Times. The other day I got a call from a graduate student who's doing a paper on the use of the staircase as a motif in the films of Hitchcock. I suggested that she write to you. How would you respond to a question like that or to academic criticism in general?
I think that staircases are made to go up and down. And therefore, they become very photogenic. That they rise, they take a figure up and down instead of keeping a figure on the flat. I suppose the most famous staircase I ever used was for a film I made in hold on to your breath, 26. And there it was a film about Jack the Ripper, and Jack the Ripper had to go out at night, about 2 a.m. And the landlady of the rooming house in which he lived sat up in bed and listened. And I had a staircase built 4 flights high, and we had to photograph her from the studio roof. And looking down the well, you saw the continuous handrail and just a white hand sliding down the whole way. Of course, today with sound, we would do creaks on the stairs, but that was the most valuable use of a staircase under those needful conditions.
And that's all for the Master of Suspense.
In High Anxiety, his most recent film, Brooks parodies the thrillers of Alfred Hitchcock, here involving a typical Hitchcock case of mistaken identity.
Dr. Thorndike?
Yes?
Here's a little present for you.
What is this? Who are you? Why are you? Wait! Who are you? What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean?
That's the man who shot him!
No, wait, you don't understand. This is not my gun. It was, oh my God. Man is dead. He shot him, I'm sure. He took off a mask. He took off my face. This was given to me by somebody who looked just like me.
Why did you do it?
Why did you do it?
That's not very scary, and I don't think very funny. You have to be a film student to know that Brooks is parodying the Hitchcock films where people like Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman have been wrongly accused of a crime and then spend the whole movie trying to prove themselves innocent. Even if you do know that, I think the film is sort of a lame joke. So, I think Mel Brooks has abandoned warm human comedies for formula parodies made especially for film freaks. It's a formula, I think, that's wearing out.
Well, I agree with your criticism of high anxiety. I think you do have to know the Hitchcock films in order to get the joke, and even then I'm not sure it's that funny because Hitchcock was there first with the joke. It's much easier in a parody to attack something that's very stuffy and takes itself very seriously.
Like the Western, maybe?
Like the Western, or in many cases the monster movie. But in the case of Hitchcock, he knows the joke already. He kids himself, and so it's very hard to outflank him.
Okay, now this next movie we have is one that no true movie buff or lover believes could ever really be made. The name of the movie is Psycho 2, and this movie has the presumption to believe that Sir Alfred Hitchcock didn't finish his story with the original Psycho back in 1960. Well, I walked into this movie with a certain amount of resistance just to the idea of any movie called Psycho 2 because I admire the original Psycho so much. But the opening half hour of the movie is sort of creepy because it reminds us so convincingly of Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, and of the violent events at the Bates Motel. Look at this scene from early in the film. Anthony Perkins hardly seems to have changed at all since 1960.
Norman! Norman! What did you put in my tea? I'm gonna get you for this, Norman! I'm gonna show you what happens to bad little boys who poison their mothers! I'm going to kill you.
That scene is a direct reference back to the original Psycho. Later in this movie, Bates offers shelter to a young girl who triggers his old phobias.
But this is yours.
No, go ahead. You have it. I'll make myself another.
Do you have a knife?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I just moved back here after being many years away, and I forgot to bring any cutlery.
That's odd. People usually leave something, even if it is only an old butter knife. Ah, there. Something wrong, Norman? Aren't you going to eat?
No, I just suddenly lost my appetite. But you go ahead. Enjoy it.
Now, there's one question you have to ask yourself. Will an audience that isn't familiar with the original Psycho get the same kind of charge out of that knife scene that we do?
Yes, I think I like the sound effect of the knife scraping on the plate.
That was nice. It means a little more if you know what Norman Bates has been up to earlier in his life?
A little more.
There's one thing Norman Bates should have learned during his 2 decades of psychiatric treatment is that he never, ever should have gone back inside that house again. But he does. And then another series of murders breaks out, and Norman thinks he's going crazy, which is a little ironic. Psycho 2 isn't a bad movie, but it's not really a worthy sequel to Psycho either. I'd suggest that the best way to enjoy this movie would be to try to put the original Psycho just totally out of your mind. But the problem is the very first opening scene of Psycho makes that impossible, because what they do is repeat Hitchcock's shower scene, and by letting Sir Alfred have the first word, they let him have the last word too.
Yeah, this is a tricky film. I think audiences would generally enjoy it, but I'm going to make my comments on grading, if you will, reviewing this specific movie. And it does nothing extra than the original film did. What I like about sequels that are good, like Godfather 2 or Rocky 2 or even Superman 2, is that they take the characters into new places. This is basically a retread with sort of a wink at the audience, and it's played as much for laughs as it is for horror. I just don't think it was anything special. We don't need this movie.
I think, well, first of all, that's right. And then secondly, do you think it would have been more interesting to have Norman Bates go out into real society, move to San Francisco or Denver or something?
Yeah.
Try to get involved in things.
I think the ghost of the original obviously hangs over this production, and it's too bad, because it's a nicely made picture.
Nicely made, but you're quite right, it's unnecessary.
We copy.
Well, after the original Psycho came out in 1960, Anthony Perkins turned down all kinds of offers for a sequel for more than 20 years. And, of course, you couldn't have a sequel without Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates. Then 2 years ago, Perkins agreed to make Psycho 2, which was an okay movie on its own terms, although, of course, it wasn't any comparison to Hitchcock's classic. Now comes Psycho 3, this time directed by Anthony Perkins as well as starring him, and this is a much better movie than Part 2. In fact, if you love the original Psycho, you might want to see this one, because this movie is especially interesting in the way it reveals some of the secrets of Norman Bates' obsessive relationship with what remains of his mother. Here's a scene from early in the film.
Well, I'm the manager, and you'd be my assistant, so I guess you'd be assistant manager. You'd get a free room, of course, and work mostly days. I prefer the nights.
Well, I gotta be straight with you, Norm.
Norman.
I'm not looking for anything long-term. I just want to make enough bucks to get the brakes on my car fixed and build up a little stake for L.A. I'm a singer. But I wouldn't mind filling in until you found somebody permanent. I just won't be staying around too long.
No one ever does.
Another visitor to Bates Motel country is a woman journalist who's doing a story on mental patients who have returned to the community, and she wants to get Norman Bates' story.
Aren't you the least bitter about what Lila Lumens tried to do to you?
I understand. My cure couldn't cure the hurt I caused. My return to sanity didn't return the dead. There's no way to make up that loss. The past is never really past. It stays with me all the time. And no matter how hard I try, I can't really escape. It's always there, throbbing inside you, coloring your perceptions of the world and sometimes controlling them.
Norman Bates does kill again in Psycho 3, but the local sheriff remains one of his main supporters, even in this macabre scene.
Well, still no reason to get so riled up and go running off like that. Well, we'll leave you alone now. Again, I'm sorry.
That's not good enough, Sheriff. You just can't let it lie.
I'm letting it lie, and so are you understand? Until I have evidence to the contrary, that young lady and Mrs. Spool are both missing persons cases.
Aren't you going to take him in for questioning or anything? Why don't you drag the swamp? That's where he dumped the last bodies.
Don't tell me my job, Miss Venable.
Well, somebody has to. You're not going to let him go.
Despite all your glib insinuations, I don't have one iota of proof that he's done anything.
I love that moment when he puts the blood-stained ice cube in his mouth and Perkins goes. In fact, Perkins does things with his mouth and eyes better than any other actor in the history of horror films, I think. The key to Psycho 3 is, of course, Norman Bates, Anthony Perkins, and in his first directing effort, Perkins shows that he knows Norman better than anyone else. He doesn't make the movie a freak show, but instead he develops some sympathy for Norman in a perverse way. Here's a man that's driven by demons that we can only imagine and uncertain of his connections with the real world. By this point, Hitchcock's original Psycho has become such an official classic that any movie named Psycho 3 is going to be routinely criticized in comparison with the Hitchcock film. All I have to say is no matter what you call this movie, Anthony Perkins has made a very good, very scary horror film, and in scenes like the one with the ice chest there, one that's very much in the Hitchcock spirit. I liked it.
That's a cute scene. I didn't get scared by the film. I was turned off by some of the violence, and I won't, of course you're not saying it compares with the original. It just sort of laid there for me. I didn't think it was bad. I just didn't care to see it. It didn't interest me. We've talked before about how in some classic movies we don't want to know how the secrets are revealed. That didn't hold any interest for me. Obviously, the speech he makes in the restaurant there about the past guiding one's present and future is obvious. And so the film just sort of sat there, and I ended up just being bored.
Well, if the violence was too much for you, what did you think about the shower scene in the original Psycho? Was that too much for you, too?
No, it wasn't too much for me. That was one of the most shocking things and original things I'd ever seen before.
Well, there's a scene in this movie where somebody gets her neck cut that is just as shocking and in the same way. And I also felt in context, not like Friday the 13th, where they're just throwing it in by the shovelful, but within context and with the character. And there's another scene in this movie.
Yeah, but it's not a classic scene. That scene will not be recalled 20 years from now. 20 years from now.
Okay, 20 years from now, no movies this year are going to be recalled for their classic scenes, probably. We're talking about a scene that stands all by itself, so that's not a valid criticism. Another thing about the movie...
You just asked me if it was a good scene.
I asked you what you said about the violence, and you said the violence was okay in one but not in the other.
That's right.
Is, if it shocked you in one and didn't shock you in the other, then...
No, obviously there can be violent films where you accept the violence. For example, Halloween is an extremely violent film that I thought was very well done. Psycho is another. This film was not. And there are tons of films that you've routinely disliked that have a lot of violence.
Yeah, but none of them have been quite this well directed, and I think the directing and acting is the whole thing when it comes to violence. There's another scene in this movie where Norman gets a note, presumably from his mother, saying, meet me in cabin number 12. And there's a long traveling shot as he walks the whole distance to that room with the camera showing in his eyes and on his mouth and in his face such a play of emotions that it's absolutely fascinating. I think this is a much better movie than you're giving it credit for.
Well, there's no question that you think it's so, and I disagree.
Say, that's the one I'd have picked for you myself.
How much will it be with my car?
You mean you don't want the usual day and a half to think it over?
No.
You are in a hurry. Somebody chasing you?
Of course not.
And that's a scene from a most curious film, a virtual shot-by-shot remake of Alfred Hitchcock's classic thriller Psycho that he made in black and white in 1960. This new film by the well-respected independent filmmaker Gus Van Sant, who directed My Own Private Idaho and Drugstore Cowboy, as well as last year's big hit, Good Will Hunting, may have been a fruitful exercise for him in film scholarship, shooting it in color, and recreating camera angles, but it plays as just weird for those who know the original. Psycho is the story of a woman from Phoenix who steals some money in order to marry her financially strapped boyfriend. On the run, she checks into a motel operated by a strange young man named Norman Bates.
You have a vacancy?
Oh, we have 12, in fact. 12 cabins, 12 vacancies. Cabin 1. It's closer in case you want anything.
That's Anne Heche in a role originally played, of course, by Janet Leigh, and Vince Vaughn, who attempts the impossible, playing the legendary role, the defining role in Anthony Perkins' career. He's simply not as creepy. Could anyone be?
I meant well.
People always mean well. It's not as if she were a maniac. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
Actually, it's hard to imagine how this project could have worked. Black and white has more impact, and once you know this famous story, it's hard to be shocked as you just sit there and wait for its most famous scenes. And the psychologist's concluding explanations of Norman's behavior, it was as hard to follow now as when I first saw Psycho nearly 40 years ago. What I really feel is if you want to see Psycho, it's obvious. Rent the original.
Rent the original, you're right. And the psychiatrist's statement is a complete waste of time. That I just cut that out. Hitchcock should have never put it in. But apart from that, I know this movie will be studied for years to come by film students curious about the experiment. What would happen if another good director took somebody else's film and remade it with a different cast? But the fact is, the cast, it's just like the original Psycho is. It exists. It's a fact. It's a classic. It's
There's
a moment
nothing
in
to
time.
be improved.
There's nothing to be improved on. Vince Vaughn, you're right, is not creepy enough.
Couldn't be.
I was thinking that maybe Jeremy Davies, the guy who plays the cowardly little corporal in Saving Private Ryan, might have been good casting. Or from this very cast, Viggo Mortensen, who's supposed to play the straight arrow boyfriend, is actually creepier than Vince Vaughn.
Roger, there are just some roles that you don't attempt.
That's right. If there's a role in all of film that you just can't duplicate, it's Norman Bates by Anthony.
Everybody wants to see him.
It's like somebody else playing Citizen Kane other than Orson Welles.
Okay.
What's the point? Okay.
They're probably watching me. Well, let them. Let them see what kind of a person I am. I'm not even going to swat that fly. I hope they are watching. They'll see. They'll see, and they'll know, and they'll say, why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.